All right, folks, time to talk some Florida football. Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. We got Jackie Franchuli on the line from the Rivals platform for Florida football and Florida athletics. Gators territory. It's dark, basically nighttime here. You still have some sunlight there, Jackie.
Yeah, it's nice to be in Florida. Our sun lasts a little bit longer during the night compared to you guys up north.
I guess so, because we had a nice bright sunny day, but all of a sudden, bam, it's pitch black outside. Well, that's all right. Let's talk some spring football there at Florida. The fan base is ecstatic. That's something I'm going to get to here in just a second. But if you ask any fan base, they can name the skill position players pretty readily, but often forget about who's along the trenches. And those are typically the guys that decide the outcome of the game. So let's look at the offensive line first, because during the Will Muschamp era, that was a trouble spot on through the Jim McElwain era. It's basically been a bad situation on the offensive line for the most part for the last 10 years until last year. Then they got a lot of good production. They had an experienced line that played really well together. And then, boom, they lose 4 of those guys, and now they're back in the starting blocks.
Yeah, and that's one of the biggest stories going into spring, is to seeing which, linemen kind of step up to that first team and see which ones they can really roll into the second deep as well. Because that's something that Mullen and Hevesy kind of stressed even last year, was they felt there was a big drop-off between the first team and the second team last year. So if you think about it, that means this group of players were the ones that they were seeing significant drop-off from last year. Now this group of players need to step up. Now, Nick Buchanan is your center. He played significant minutes last year. He was a starter. So that is your lone starter returning. Now, the good news for Florida is that a lot of the other guys returning do have some game time experience, like Chris Bleich, like Richard Garage, like Stone Forsythe, like DeLance. Those are guys that have some of game time experience. Obviously, they didn't start, but they did have they did rotate in. Now, the bad news for Florida is that Noah Banks has not been cleared to practice yet. Now, he did have some minutes last year, but he had a medical issue during bowl prep. He had something with vertigo, and he collapsed during practice, and he hasn't been cleared to play. That's something that, Florida staff are really, following closely and talking to the doctors to see when can he be cleared. So that's something that we're monitoring, because Noah Banks is a guy they feel can be like a Swiss Army knife for the line. He can kind of be a tackle. He can be a guard. So that's someone you can compare with, like a Tyler Jordan from last year for Florida, who kind of rotated in several different positions. As far as the line right now, I think the biggest story for me especially is those 4 true freshmen that have early enrolled. It's such a great thing for Florida to have those early guys getting already some significant minutes in spring. And because there's not many line there returning, they're getting a lot of snaps. Michael Tarquin was already playing with the second team. Ethan White, who lost 35 pounds already in just 3 months at Florida, is also taking second team reps. Out of all the freshmen, I think people need to watch for Michael Tarquin. I think he's the most ready of all the linemen to really feature next year. I think he can really rotate in. So I think that's a guy to watch. And another guy that's not featured this spring is Griffin McDowell. He had an accident on his scooter, so he had a leg injury, so he's not featuring this spring. But he's someone that can back up Nick Buchanan at center. So I think that's something that we're going to be watching, especially next couple of weeks, because John Hevesy said right now they're just installing the offense. So that means they're not going to tweak guys and moving, guys from left tackle to right guard. But that's what they're going to be doing in like a week or two when they do scrimmages. They want to make sure they have guys that can kind of fill in spots if a guy is injured. Don't forget, Brett Heggie is a guy that is going to be featuring a lot for Florida this year, but he has not had a full healthy season as a Gator. So they want to make sure that they have contingency plans for their contingency plans when the season starts.
Always appreciate the Florida football talk. We got Jackie Franchuli on the line from Gators territory. It's on the Rivals platform for Florida athletics. And we talked offensive line. Let's go to the defensive line, because that's a concern as well, especially when you face 2 of the better running teams in the nation, at least last season, in Georgia and Kentucky. And you got to be strong up the middle. And that's not necessarily a point of strength, at least on paper.
Yeah, I think that's something that a lot of people are focused on and want to see this spring, because don't forget, they only signed 1 defensive tackle in Jalen Humphreys during last class. So right now you're looking at Kyrie Campbell and Adam Schuler as your 2 guys that would take reps the ones and you expect to start in the interior. I think Kyrie Campbell has really cemented himself as a leader. That's what I heard last night when we talked to several defensive linemen. I think he's done a great job since he's got to Florida to kind of fix his body, and he's really bought into this new coaching staff. I think the two guys that I'm focused on more in spring is Elijah Conleaf and Tadaro Slayton. Those guys have done so well in practices. I think they were, some of the guys we highlighted last spring. We highlighted again during fall camp, but then they had this drop off during the year. And that's something the staff is aware of. Dan Mullen said on Tuesday that he's hoping that those guys find a way to translate what they do in the practice field so they can do it during game time, because the way Todd Grantham runs his defense is all about rotating guys in and out, and they need depth in the interior. Now, they have been playing around with some guys and kind of switching positions. That's something that, Dan Mullen and Todd Grantham like, is recruiting versatile defenders so they can kind of go in different places on the line. A guy like Zach Carter, who's a redshirt sophomore, he was recruited as a defensive end by the former staff, but he can move inside now. And that's something that we've seen in the first couple of practices. He has moved in the 3-tech position. He's played a little bit of tackle, a little bit of end. And Malik Langham, who's a redshirt freshman, he's also moved inside as well. And he was recruited as a defensive end. So I think they're playing around with some of those guys as well. And it's going to be interesting to see how they kind of fix the rotation. I think Zach Carter is a guy that could see the field maybe next year. Malik Langham is probably a year or two out from possibly contributing. I think he's on the right track. When we see him, his body is a lot leaner. He's gained more muscle weight. I think he told me around 15 pounds of muscle weight, and he's dropped his body fat. So he's working on getting his body right, but he's still a little young. So I feel he's probably like a year or two out. But Zach Carter is definitely a guy that looks the part. And it's someone to watch on the interior. And obviously we're with Todd Grantham's defense. You want to look at those rush ends. You want to see who's stepping up. And a guy that I was really impressed with is true freshman Mohamed Diabate. He enrolled in January, and I think could be a factor early on, because don't forget, Jeremiah Moon injured his foot in the agility drills back in January, so he's not participating in spring. And he was a guy that we discussed maybe taking over Ja'Kai Polite's position. With Ja'Kai Polite gone, Jeremiah Moon injured, a guy like Diabate and maybe Andrew Chatfield are two guys that now you're thinking, maybe he can step up in this role. And obviously you've got Jonathan Greenard, your transfer from Louisville, is another name to kind of look in this position. So Florida does have a lot of talent. It's just trying to work out how they're going to put those puzzle pieces together.
We talk college football here nonstop at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. So to keep the channel running, smash that like button, comment, subscribe, share the videos as well. We bring on the best bloggers, broadcasters, and writers in the industry, including Jackie Franchuli from Gators territory. So Jackie, you've done an outstanding job a number of times when we've talked about Dan Mullen and the fit at Florida in describing what that means. It seems as though from the first time he stepped off the plane in Gainesville after he got the job from Mississippi State, that everything's worked well. Aside from maybe a letdown against Missouri, the season went out as well as expected after a great recruiting class, and then more recruiting successes this offseason, and everything seems to be going well. I hear Gator fans talking about championship, challenging Georgia, and it's automatic, boom, just going to go right in line, and now we're next we're going to knock off the Bulldogs. And certainly that could happen, but I don't think there's any question by anybody who's neutral on the situation that more things have to happen correctly for Florida to win the SEC East than Georgia. It's going to take a few years to catch up on the roster side of things across the board.
Yeah, I think the Gator fans are certainly optimistic right now. You talk to anybody and they think they have a chance. Now, the SC East is a different animal. It's very interesting when you kind of see those matchups together, when you look at them. I think Florida's schedule is favorable to them next year. I honestly think they have a chance to compete with Georgia, just looking at the schedule that they have next year. I think although Auburn coming to Gainesville is certainly one to watch, I think that'll be an interesting one for Florida. But Mullen has better talent than people give him credit for, especially defensively. I think defensively, Florida is pretty talented. And I know we just talked about how in the interior line, the defensive line, they have issues with depth. But if they get Slayton and Conleaf to play to their full potential, you can argue that they have a very, very solid defensive line that could compete with the likes of Georgia. I think in the last year's game, if you look at it, the game kind of went away from them in the second half. And I'm not saying that I'm picking Florida to win the SEC championship, but to say that Georgia is too far away I don't think is really accurate. I think Florida can compete with Georgia for the SEC East, especially when you look at the other teams and where they're at as far as recruiting and as far as talent. The one thing I will say about Mullen that I really do like is the fact that he's able to take players that were maybe not recruited by many guys or might have not, been recruited at a position that maybe was their strength, and kind of put them in a system that works for them. I think Kyle Pitts was one that I was, really not surprised, but really liked what he did. Kyle Pitts was recruited as a tight end. He was only a 3-star guy from Pennsylvania. And now he's one of their go-to guys at receiver, but he was recruited as a tight end. But he's such a mismatch because of his frame and how big he is that they're now using him out wide as a wide receiver. And I think that's what I like about Mullen. And that's why I think when you look at the talent that Mullen has this year, as far as Lucas Kroll has gotten 1 year under his belt with football. Don't forget, he didn't play football for 3 years. He was a baseball pitcher. He's back. So you've got 2 mismatches, and Lucas Kroll and Kyle Pitts. Then the only thing that I will say that might hinder them is the offensive line that we talked about earlier here, because we don't know how quickly this young group can really learn. So I think if their offensive line kind of catches up with everything, I think Florida will be better and compete with Georgia. That is the X factor. The O-line will determine how good this team is.
Yeah, we tend to look at final scores, and I believe it was 36-17, but I watched every play of that game, and going through the scoring sequence, I think Florida came out second half and put together a nice drive, took the lead 17-16, and about halfway through the third quarter, we had a really good football game, and even going into the fourth quarter with maybe 11 or 12 minutes left, it was still like a one-score game and still anybody's ball game at that point. Correct. And then Georgia took over late in the ball game, and Florida certainly made some mistakes that led to the scoring difference at the end of the game. Jackie, we appreciate you stopping by as always and appreciate the information and the insight.
Thanks, Mark, for having me.